Hi, welcome to Fitness Facts. In this video, I'll be covering the basic differences between training for muscular strength, power, hypertrophy, or size, and endurance. In the process, I'll refer to some information I covered in previous videos on energy production and the factors that contribute to muscular strength. So, let's get started. In order to develop muscular strength, power, hypertrophy, or endurance, the muscle needs to be overloaded beyond its normal capacity. But here's the important point. Overload to the muscle can involve increases in neural activation, mechanical load, metabolic stress, and muscle damage. These are the most likely mechanisms or reasons behind any gains in muscular strength, power, hypertrophy, or endurance. And it's these mechanisms that dictate the difference between training for strength, power, hypertrophy, or endurance. For example, from the National Strength and Conditioning Association, here's a continuum for training for those four goals, based on repetition maximums or RMs. Now, before I go on, a couple of qualifiers. 1. Untrained people will develop muscle size and strength with any combination of load, volume, and frequency. But as they continue with regular resistance training, the program will have to become more goal specific if they want to achieve further gains in strength and size. 2. For experienced weightlifters, that continuum or any recommendations are not absolute. The recommendations to follow are just guidelines to start you on your way to a particular goal. And as I'll address later, deviations from these guidelines at times become necessary. Now let's go into more detail for each of the goals, starting with muscular strength. Strength training uses loads greater than 85% of maximum RMs. Lifting high loads or resistance increases the mechanical load inside the muscle, which you can think of as the tension, stress, or pressure inside the fibers. High loads also mean the muscles rely heavily on anaerobic metabolism, which means an increase in acid, lactate, and a reduction in phosphocreatine. This metabolic stress causes muscle fatigue, but can also stimulate protein synthesis. High loads also cause that muscle damage. But a high load also requires motor units to fire faster and the recruitment of additional motor units. Over time, these changes to the motor units become greater and permanent, resulting in significant strength gains. Now, some hypertrophy will occur with strength training, in large part due to the mechanical load, but also due to the metabolic stress and muscle damage. But the key to developing strength over hypertrophy is the enhanced neural recruitment and adaptations that come with lifting high loads. Given the high load requirement, strength training volume is often lower and the rest between sets is often greater than training for hypertrophy or endurance. Too much volume elevates the metabolic stress and too much rest allows it to remain high, which, due to its fatigue-causing substances, will reduce the mechanical load in subsequent sets. This will reduce strength gains because the overload in those sets won't be great enough to recruit additional motor units, particularly the fast fatigable units and their type 2X fibers. In other words, to lift high loads great enough to recruit additional motor units, the metabolic stress has to be kept relatively low, which happens with less volume and greater rest. Now, when it comes to sports performance, muscular power is often more important than strength or size. Training for muscular power requires a moderate but not too fast contraction speed or movement pattern, which means moving a little lighter load of around 75 to 90% of maximum. The number of reps and therefore the volume is also lower. This delays fatigue to help ensure correct sport-specific movement patterns. Typically, power training involves 3 to 5 sets with 2 to 5 minutes of rest in between. Those sets would include 1 to 2 reps if training for a single effort event, or 3 to 5 if training for a multi-effort event. Hypertrophy training is based on prolonging the mechanical load, rather than increasing motor unit activation. So compared to strength training, this is done with lighter loads, but greater volume, like 3 to 6 sets with 6 to 12 reps. The greater volume prolongs the mechanical load, which, rather than metabolic stress or muscle damage, appears to be the primary stimulator of muscle hypertrophy. But that metabolic stress and muscle damage do play a secondary role in developing muscle hypertrophy, which includes adding more proteins, sarcoplasm, and other cellular contents to the muscle fibers. With those added proteins, strength gains will also occur with hypertrophy training. Now, we know that muscle protein synthesis remains elevated for 48 hours after a workout. Therefore, for strength, power, and hypertrophy training, it's recommended to have at least one rest or recovery day per muscle group. But the amount of rest may be reduced as the muscle adapts to training, as long as overtraining is avoided. Moving on, developing muscle endurance involves loads less than 67%, 12 or more reps, and 2 to 3 sets with 30 seconds of rest in between. Since the mechanical load, metabolic stress, and muscle damage is minimal, there's no need for rest or recovery days in most cases. As I mentioned earlier, these recommendations are merely starting points towards your resistance training goals, and not absolute guidelines. Since these 4 different types of training produce different stimuli to the muscle, training across a broad spectrum of training types or zones may be advisable, such as adding some hypertrophy zones to a strength training program and vice versa. Beyond that, for highly trained individuals, another option is to employ some advanced training methods. For example, you could try forced repetitions, drop sets, pre-post exhaustion, supersets, and heavy negatives, among others. But be on the lookout for signs of overtraining, and don't ignore the importance of adequate rest and sleep. Thanks for listening. I hope that bringing in the physiology behind the training recommendations was helpful, and I hope you'll view some of my other videos. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section below. As always, my answers come from peer-reviewed research linked in that comment section.